Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda. Today, we're going to look at a parable that Jesus gives in Luke 12. And this, by the way, was a suggestion by a patron on Patreon. So appreciate your support. And it is the parable about the rich man. And we're going to see how it's anchored in the Deuterocanonical book of Sirach. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. All right, so like I said, we're going to be looking at a parable of Jesus, and Jesus's parable seems to be anchored in a deuterocanonical book of Sirach. And as I mentioned before, a supporter of this channel mentioned that he'd like to see a video done on this, and this actually was on my list of things to do. So I thought, I'll move it up, and we'll take a look at this very interesting parallel between Sirach and our Lord's words in Luke 12. And to begin with, I want to point out this, what's been noted by Henry Wansbrough in his introduction to the New Testament. He says, quote, on several occasions, a parable seems to be based on a saying of the Old Testament. The rich fool in Luke 12:13-21, on Sirach 11:18-20. That's the passage we're going to be looking at today. The unjust judge, 18:1-8, in Sirach 35:14-15, and the places at table in 14:7-10 on Proverbs 25:6. So here, Wansbaugh, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, points out how Jesus's parables are rooted in the Old Testament, at least the proto-canonical book of Proverbs, but we'll also argue, as he points out, also in the book of Sirach with the rich fool. So in case you're not familiar with it, let's take a look at both passages. First passage is Luke, and this is 16-21. It reads, then he told him a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, what shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest. And he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods. And I shall say to myself, now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this night your life will be demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus it will be for one who stores up treasure for himself, but is not rich in what matters to God. So I know this is a parable we're all familiar with, and maybe so familiar with, we maybe not really take a second glance at it. But it seems as though Jesus is using in the background another area, which is in the book of Sirach. So let's look at Sirach 11. Sirach 11, it's only a couple of verses, but you can see the outline of what Jesus just said right here. Sirach 11:18-19 says, quote, a man may become rich through a miser's life. This is his allotted reward. When he says, quote, I have found rest, now I will feast on my possessions, unquote, he does not know how long it will be till he dies and leaves them to others. So you can see parallel thoughts there, right? Jesus's parable seems to be an expansion of what we find in Sirach 11. And the Dictionary of the New Testament Background has this to say regarding this seemingly dependency. It says the Gospels and the apocryphal writings, there are a few similarities between the teachings of Jesus and the book of Sirach. And it continues, a further close parallel is Jesus's parable of the rich fool who lays up treasure in his own achievements, then dies and leaves his wealth behind. And it cites our two passages. Now, later on in this particular paragraph, he writes, quote, one cannot prove conclusively that these different New Testament writers used the apocryphal writings because in no instance is there an exact quotation. Nevertheless, the similarities do show a common thought and vocabulary reflective of the world of the first century Judaism, of first century Judaism. And this is from Patrick J. Harton's Apocryphal and Pseudepigraphical Sources in the New Testament. And that's the article. The book's name is Dictionary of the New Testament Background, a compendium of contemporary biblical scholarship. Okay, so a couple of remarks about Harton's words here. First, he realizes that, yeah, Jesus's parables seem to have similarities, as he puts it, with the book of Sirach. And he even says a further close parallel. So he understands Luke 12 and Sirach 11 as a close parallel to one another. And he goes through some other things as well, but at the end, of course, he has to diss the Deuterocanon, which he calls apocryphal. And so he says, we can't prove conclusively that these different New Testament writers use the apocryphal works because there's no instance of there being an exact quotation, which again, I guess prove conclusively an exact quotation. I guess an exact quotation would prove conclusively that that's its source. But, how many times do we find conclusive proof about things? Do we limit the evidence only to exact quotations? And so I don't have a lot of sympathy for that kind of dismissal. That being said, of course, he says, nevertheless, the similarities do show a common thought and vocabulary reflective of first century Judaism. Well, no, it doesn't. It shows a common thought and vocabulary reflective of the so-called apocryphal books. Notice how he generalizes the conclusion, right? That's what his conclusion should have read. But because that would be a pretty strong statement in favor of the Deuterocanon, or the apocryphal works, as he puts it, he has to generalize it to reflective of the world of the first century Judaism, as if there really is no connection between Jesus and Ecclesiasticus or the book of Sirach, even though he states that it is a close parallel. So I don't get that. I don't know why he generalizes it at the end, other than it's simply a nice little escape from some conclusions that maybe you feel uncomfortable with. Nevertheless, let's continue. So let's see whether Jesus's words and Sirach 11 really do have a close connection, or perhaps that maybe they don't. Okay, so I highlighted the words here and give you the Greek, and we'll look at some interesting points of contact. Okay, let's begin with Jesus. He says, now as for you, you have many good things. Okay. In Sirach 11, the rich man says, I have found rest. Now I will feast on my possessions. Okay. First, both passages, both passages, interesting enough, contain soliloquies of the rich man. Okay. That's interesting in and of itself, because you don't find a lot of soliloquies in the Bible in general. And it's interesting that both of these passages have soliloquies. Okay. By the way, a soliloquy, if you're not familiar with, is simply where a person talks to themselves. Okay. We do find it throughout the Bible, but it's interesting both have that feature. Both concern a rich man. And notice both the soliloquies are reflecting on the present situation. So it says noon in Greek. Both of them say now. The second thing, it describes the rich man's possessions, not as gold or silver or flocks or whatever, or grain, but he calls them good things. Agatha, okay? or ton agathon, if you want the plural. Okay. So both passages speak of the treasure as good things, or yeah, I guess you would say just good things, right? Another interesting parallel too is, and I think this is kind of the clincher, okay? The rich man in both cases realizes that now he has found rest, okay? And that's highlighted with the dark blue. I'm not sure it'll come out on this video, but the word rest in Greek is the same word, just different forms of the same word. And that's interesting that you would have rest, okay? Now, Jesus in Luke 12 said, the rich man says, I'll store up, now that I have good things, store up for many years, rest, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, eat, drink, and be merry, of course, reflects back to the Psalms, right? But rest is different. It seems to be a word in there that you wouldn't associate with eat, drink, and be merry, right? But it is there, and it happens to be the same Greek word used in Sirach 11. And the same idea, the rich man there in his soliloquy says to himself because he has stored up many goods. Okay? So there's a number of interesting parallels, both in Greek, both in the structure and in the overall story. Okay. Both Jesus and Sirach 11 talk about the end of life. Okay. God says to the rich man in Luke 12, you fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? So not only does death come, right, that makes those goods for the rich man, superfluous. But in both cases, notice both there and in Sirach, it speaks of death and also raises the question of whose property will this become? You see that? To whom will they belong? In Sirach, it says, leaves them to others. Okay. So they both make the same point in terms of once death comes, you no longer possess these things. Also in verse 21, thus it will be for one who stores up treasure for himself, but is not rich in what matters to God. Similar thought, although not exact, is in 26, Sirach 11. For it is easy for the Lord on the day of death to repay a man according to his deeds. So you have a kind of commensurate value, right, going on. Jesus says what matters is storing up for things, riches that matter to God instead of yourself. Sirach is on the day of death, God will repay you according to your deeds. I think there is a kind of parallel there, but a very weak one. So numerous parallels, numerous literary forms. They're both soliloquies. They're both talking about rich man, same outline. Jesus, of course, is the expansion because he focuses on storing up much treasure that the rich man's going to have to build more storage, and then he could rest. Both of them rest. Oh, and one thing I did miss also. How did I miss this? In both cases, not only do both rest, but both will eat. Okay. And it's the same word, by the way. It's just a normal word for eat in Greek. Jesus is, rich man says, rest, eat, drink, and be merry. In Sirach 11, the rich man says to himself, now I will feast on my possessions. The word feast there is the same Greek word, phage, which is used by Jesus, just different form. Very interesting stuff, right? Very interesting stuff. Now, there's actually one more deuterocanonical connection here on top of all of this, and that is in Luke 12:20. Luke 12:20, Jesus says, or God says to the rich man, you fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And in Greek, it is your soul will be demanded. Okay. This actually parallels not Sirach, but Wisdom 15, verse 8. Now, unlike Sirach 11, where there is multiple lines of parallels between what Sirach says and what Jesus says, both in terms of the very words used, the concepts, the literary genre, things like that. This one is only words, okay? Because the context is a bit different in Wisdom 15:8. Wisdom 15:8 says, and with misspent toil, he molds a meaningless God from the self-same clay. Though he himself shortly before was made from the earth, and after a little is to go whence from what he's taken, when the life that he was lent is demanded back. Okay, so obviously two very different parallels, situations, but both deal with death. That's kind of interesting, right? In a little while, man who was made from earth returns to the earth, and God demands the life that he lends him. The words there are the same words used by Jesus, that the soul will be demanded back. And there is also a conceptual parallel as well, because both texts, one's life is something that is lent to them by God and will be demanded back at death. So the same kind of concepts at work. Now that I could say, did Jesus borrow from this? Maybe. And actually, there could be some very interesting thoughts about that, because since Wisdom 15:8 is talking about idolatry, someone making an idol for themselves, that's kind of interesting, because if that's part of the backdrop of Jesus's words in Luke 12, then perhaps Jesus is suggesting, by using this verbiage, that the goods that we store, earthly goods, earthly riches, are akin to like our own idols, right? That would add a very interesting dimension to Jesus's parable, wouldn't it? But nevertheless, there is this hearkening to Wisdom 15, just in those words. But I think a much stronger case, however, is made with the parallel with Sirach 11, 18, 19, 26. Okay, so am I just reading things into the text, or is there really something there? Well, we've already seen a couple of Protestant sources. They are, and these are modern sources that say, yeah, there's a close parallel going on here. Although they may not argue for dependency, but they're not alone. In fact, in early Protestant Bibles that used to contain the so-called Apocrypha, there would be cross-references that were made throughout the Bible, just like Bibles today. And that would include cross-references in the so-called Apocrypha and in the New Testament. And guess what? This was something that was seen in cross-references of early Protestant Bibles. For example, the Coverdale Bible. These are the links between Luke 12 and Sirach 11. You have the Coverdale, 1535, Great Bible, 1541, Taverner's Bible, 1551, Geneva Bible, or Geneva New Testament, 1557, Bishop's Bible, 1568, Geneva Bible, 1583, Geneva Bible, 1599, King James, 1611. Then you have the King James Blaney edition in 1798, the Kahn version in 1828. Also, you have cross references to wisdom as well in the Geneva Bible, 1560, Geneva 1583, 1599, King James 1611, the two editions of the King James Bible, and also the Cambridge Paragraph Bible, 1573. So early Protestant Bibles had cross references from Luke 12 to Sirach 11, Of course, once the so-called Apocrypha were removed from Protestant Bibles, so were all these cross-references, okay? So this was something that was seen by Protestants early on, that there is a definite connection between Jesus's words and Sirach 11. And yeah, so I actually have a couple of snippets here. If you're just curious, if you think I'm making up about the cross references, I don't have all of them there. But here you can see pictures of the Coverdale Great Bible. Notice some are from Sirach to Luke, some are from Luke to Sirach. The ones from Sirach to Luke are on the left, the one from Luke to Sirach are on the right. So there is a couple of reciprocal, that's why I call reciprocal cross references, that both books refer to each other. There's a couple of standalones, like the Taverner's Bible just has Sirach referring to Luke 12, but it doesn't have Luke 12 reverting back to Sirach. Yeah, the Geneva New Testament, of course, there's only the New Testament reference to Sirach. Bishop Bible's reciprocal, King James 1611. And I wasn't able to get clips of the different editions of the King James. Now, this is true for those English Bibles, but it's also true for non-English Protestant Bibles. Now, this is not in chronological order, but I just want to show you here the Spanish Bear Bible, 1569, Alatam Bible, Zurich Bible, 1535. You have Theodore Beza's translation of New Testament, 1565. The Zurich Bible, 1540, has a reference from Sirach to Luke 12, as you can see here. And then you have the Dujan Tremelis Beza translation 1617, where in the New Testament, in Luke 12, you have the reference back to Sirach 11:19. So this is widely seen in early Protestant scriptures. They saw the connection there. Modern scholars see the connection there. Do you see the connection there? Well, let me know. Put some comments and suggestions. And by the way, while you're at it, smash the like button. We appreciate it. It helps us get some visibility. Also, tell your friends about the channel if you know anybody that's maybe asking questions about how it is that Catholic and Orthodox Bibles have more books than Jewish and Protestant Bibles. They might be interested in this channel. Also, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your support. I want to thank all of you on Patreon for supporting us. It enables us to do the work, to do the research and produce these videos and make them known throughout the world. And that's all because of you. So we appreciate that. Till next time, I'm Gary Mitsuda. Have a great week. Bye-bye, everyone.